The next troubleshooting area we're going to touch on is during the exposure process. Now the things we're going to touch on and the most common problems during this process is your film not being dark enough, so your positive actually not blocking out the light from reaching the emulsified screen. Not enough positive contact or pressure, so light works its way around the film. That means when your film is not pressed tight against the screen mesh. And then underexposure and overexposure. If you don't have a very good printer, your films are probably going to come out looking like this. If you see that, that's not a very good positive. You can actually see light through this area. This one's a little bit darker and this one's a little bit lighter. What we'll demonstrate right now is the difference between these two films and this film right here. This is a very dense film, even with some halftones and detail in it. And this is a very block, easy to print design. However, the film positive is very light and poor quality. We'll put these on the same screen and expose them for the proper amount of time and show you what happens during a washout. Here we have our screen that's been exposed with a very, very light film, a poor quality but a little darker film, and then a very opaque film. We'll show what happens during the washout process. Now, a really quick but kind of funny troubleshooting point is you do want to take your films off before you wash the screens out. We have had customers that don't understand that you need to do this, and that does cause a little bit of a problem during washout. So definitely want to make sure to take your films off the screen. If we zoom in here, you can actually see this screen is unexposed but fairly light. This screen is unexposed and a little bit lighter, and you can barely see this screen exposure right here because this film positive was so light. So let's get this soaked and start washing it out. As this image starts to develop under the water, you can see the opaque positive almost already starting to wash out. This one you can kind of see it's going to come loose, but this one is still very, very, very faint. We'll let it soak and then go to washout. Remember, a proper exposure with a proper positive density, you should be able to have no problem using a pressure washer. What happens is if you try to wash out these two lighter areas of the screen, you have to use so much water the emulsion starts to absorb all the water and then it actually starts to degrade off the screen. So you actually do what's called blowing out your image, which is not good, meaning you'll have to start all the way over again. You'll see this first image just drop out, and then we'll start working on these other two images. All right, that one's already exposed and washed out. Now let's try these other two. That one's starting to come out on the bottom, but we're going to have to work on it from both sides. Remember, if you're working on it from the back side, you're pushing against the emulsion because the emulsion is sitting on the outside of your screen. So it's a lot easier to blow a screen out if you're pushing against the back side of it. Well, we see this one starting to wash out here. The top one still is not. So let's switch to a more softer hose. Well, maybe we can scrub our fingers on it to kind of agitate some of that emulsion to get it moving away from the mesh. You can see this emulsion was partially exposed, so that's why it doesn't want to release from the mesh. Instead of falling off like this one did, it's slowly gripping and then just peeling off. This one up here, we're seeing it, but it's not doing anything. This one's almost washed out, and I think our emulsion is going to hold on long enough for it to allow to wash out completely. Wow, that worked. If you zoom in here, you can see these edges starting to swell up with water and starting to peel away from the mesh already. Now this is what your result would be if you're using a low-end inkjet printer or like a laser printer with vellum or low-quality inkjet film. You can see how much more of a pain this was to wash out than this one using like a Black Max printer with AccuRip software. Super easy, pain in the butt. How much is your time worth? This is a lot harder to do, a lot more complications. We're lucky we even got it to wash out. Now let's still continue to try to wash this one out up here. Maybe let's try some pressure again. All right, that one's ruined. You see I've already starting to blow out my image. Here's my film positive. It did wash out, but you see the edge of the area of the emulsion right here? It's already degrading, and we blew out the image. So this one would not work. And that is what happens if you have to put too much water on your screen, use too much pressure to blow it out because your film positives are not dense enough. The obvious solution to this troubleshooting problem is opaque film positives with a good quality inkjet printer using a special dye-based ink and a RIP software if you can get away with it. Also with that waterproof positive film that retains more of that ink. Lower quality printers might work but will take a lot longer, and then sometimes they just don't work at all. Use dark positives and you'll be much better off. The next thing we'll troubleshoot is what happens when there's not enough positive contact between the positive film and the mesh, meaning this is not pressed tightly against the mesh behind it. The way this can happen is just by simply not using pressure whatsoever on your exposure unit. We've had a lot of people that instead of putting foam down, they just put a piece of wood down, which doesn't evenly distribute the pressure across the mesh. So what we'll do is demonstrate kind of the extreme effect of what can happen, and we'll just turn this exposure unit on without using any weight or foam on top of it. Even during the exposure, you can see that this is not pressed tightly against the mesh. So if I press this down against the positive, you can see that would be a good positive contact right there, where my finger's pressing closely down. But you can see there's light definitely working its way around. We'll show the cause and effect of this when we wash it out. Now we'll wash out the screen that does not have enough positive contact between the film and the mesh. You can see the exposure area. You can even see the blurriness in the film positive image area. This image, instead of being crisp and clear, because it's a spot color image, it should look very crisp and clear. It's very blurry. You can still see it, but very blurry edges, not very much definition. Let's try to wash it out. Now that our image has soaked up some water, we'll try to wash it out. Turn on the backlight. We see the emulsion fall immediately out of the screen because we did use a dark enough emulsion. However, our detail is just not there. Our edges are all very blurry. Some of the finer detail is not even coming out in the image. You really have to work on these smaller lines up here because the image was not pressed firmly against the screen mesh, so much light worked its way around it. Now we're even starting to blow out some of the screen area up there. That's a good enough example to show you what happens. Now our big bold text, that washed out, but still not very good quality. it would look kind of distressed and not very sharp on the shirt. And then this finer image area up here didn't wash out all the way, and as you can see right here, we're starting to blow out the image. Now we could come back and block that out possibly, but the best thing to do is just use positive contact, and that's a very easy fix to do. Remember, positive contact equals positive results. Next, we'll show underexposure. Instead of exposing the screen for the proper amount of time for 4 minutes, 30 seconds, we're going to expose it for 2.5 minutes and show you what happens during the underexposed screen and how that affects the washout and then even the final print. So bump that down here quite a bit. And then we'll expose. Now we have our underexposed screen. Now this had everything else going for it. It had a good positive contact, it had a very dense film, but we exposed it for about half the exposure time to show what happens with an underexposed screen. First thing that you can tell, as soon as you start to wash the screen out, the emulsion will feel slimy. So we feel the back here. This emulsion is very, very slimy, and you can see it start to set up quite a bit. During the exposure process, what's going on is the light is not being allowed to penetrate all the way through to the back of the frame. So this emulsion back here is left unexposed, whereas the front part of the emulsion is left exposed. You can see it starting to film up on the back of the frame area right here. If you look closely, you can even see red diazo or yellow diazo dripping off of the frame and onto the film on the bottom. It's got like a little yellowish tint to it. Definitely not exposed long enough. Now our image is still washing out, which is good. That's why using a DXP very, very easily to use friendly emulsion is very good as you're starting out, because you can see this is still working even though our screen's underexposed. Now what's happening with this underexposed screen is we're losing a lot of our halftones. These halftones should be sticking to the screen, but we're losing them right here. Actually a pretty good positive result. We had some of halftones drop out, but most of them stayed in. We even got our registration marks to expose and wash out. However, what's happening now is that there's diazo dripping into the frame. You see this slime on the back of the screen right here? This is unexposed diazo. So what's happening is as this water starts to drip into the frame, it's actually dripping unexposed emulsion into the washed out area. If that's allowed to dry, that's going to block our screen. We're going to have to come back with like a toothpick or some type of emulsion remover to try to get it out of this image area. Also, see how easily these halftones remove from the screen? This should stick, but any pressure at all will make that halftone, fall right off the screen mesh. The other thing to keep in mind about an underexposed screen is that even though we probably could have made this work and successfully printed a shirt with it, it would have broken down so much faster and not last even near as long as a properly exposed screen because this emulsion is so sensitive. We'll have a lot more pinholes as we start to print through it. You can even see some pinholes starting to break open right now, even before we start to print through it, but the emulsion is not very strong, so it's going to break down a lot faster during the printing process. The other thing about an underexposed screen is that as soon as it's receptive to ink and then your chemicals that you clean the ink out of the screen with, that underexposed emulsion absorbs that in. If it was exposed properly, it would be hard and resist all those chemicals in that ink. But since it's underexposed, the pores are still left open in the emulsion and it absorbs all that in. The chemical reacts to the emulsion and locks the emulsion in the frame. So if we printed with that and then came back to try to wash it out, it would be very difficult to wash out. Whereas a properly exposed screen, because it's solid and it has a hard resistant surface to it, stands up to these inks and chemicals and makes washout a lot easier. If you see the bottom of the washout stick, you can see how much diazo is dripping off the back of our screen area. You can also see the diazo starting to drip into the exposure area. That will dry in the screen and make it very hard to print and block the print. The other thing to keep in mind about your exposure unit itself is that when it's new, it's going to expose screens a lot faster than 6 months down the road, a year down the road. You need to increase your exposure time. If you start to see a lot of diazo starting to drip through your image area, or if you see a lot of slime building up, just up your exposure time by 10-20 seconds. And continue to do that until you see the slime and the diazo drips go away. If your film positives are not dense enough, what you can do is stack them on top of each other. If you notice, this person right here exposing this screen had a very light film positive, but they stacked 3 on top of each other and then taped them together. So once they're done, they actually have a fairly dense image. It's not perfectly lined up, but you see the difference between that and then just one. It's very important to have an opaque positive, as we saw. So sometimes you might have to finagle stuff like this to get better results. It's kind of worth it. But remember, it's a lot easier just getting the right printer and the right software. The last thing we'll touch on is an overexposed screen. Now this is probably one of the least common troubleshooting areas in the emulsioning process, because if you have a good positive film in the first place, if it's very dense and you have a good positive contact, it's really hard to overexpose your screen. Your film is going to be dense enough to continue to block out the exposure light, and if that positive contact is strong enough, then no light will get around that dense film. So overexposure is really not much of an issue. It's typically an issue when you have lower quality films, but what does happen during overexposure, if you really overexpose the screen way too long, is that light does start to work its way around the edge of the image area. Similar to this right here, as we saw with not enough positive contact, but it's much less extreme with an overexposed screen. An overexposed screen will just have a lot of heat that travels into the emulsion, and it will be harder to wash out. But really, it's not something to be concerned about if you're using the right types of film positives and have a good positive contact between your film positive and your screen mesh. That wraps it up for this troubleshooting section. We'll do a little more troubleshooting during the reclaiming process and what happens if you have too much emulsion or a locked screen when you try to reclaim it. But really watch this section in depth and apply it to what you're doing in the darkroom. Emulsion can be a pain and you can pull your hair out if you don't know what you're doing. So this section will really help you out and get the best results.